It did not look like a revolutionary idea. There was no laboratory, no investors waiting in glass towers, no viral launch, no dramatic pitch competition. Just a small, almost forgettable observation made by a man most people overlooked. He wasn't born into money. He wasn't connected to power. His last name didn't unlock doors. He grew up in a house where bills were discussed in whispers, and opportunity felt like something that happened to other families. Wealth in his childhood wasn't a goal, it was a rumor. But he noticed something early that others ignored. Most people chase income, very few understand ownership. That single realization didn't feel powerful at first, it felt unfair. He worked hourly jobs through his 20s, construction in summer heat, warehouse shifts under fluorescent lights, delivery routes in neighborhoods wealthier than he could imagine living in. Every paycheck disappeared into rent, food, gas, survival. And yet, he noticed something strange. The people paying him weren't necessarily smarter. They weren't working harder. Often, they weren't even present. They owned a rental property, a small distribution contract, a licensing agreement, a patent filed years ago, a percentage of something that continued producing money whether they showed up or not. That was the idea. Not work harder, not save more, own something that scales. It was almost insultingly simple, but simplicity is deceptive because owning something meaningful requires seeing value before others do. His moment came during what most would call a failure. He had tried starting a small service business, nothing glamorous. Margins were thin, competition was heavy. After months of grinding, he realized he wasn't building wealth, he was building a job for himself. If he stopped working, revenue stopped immediately. That night, exhausted and frustrated, he studied his own numbers. The business wasn't failing because demand was low. It was failing because the service couldn't multiply without multiplying his time. Time was the ceiling. So he asked a dangerous question. What if, instead of selling service, he sold a system? The idea formed slowly. Instead of doing the work himself, he would design a repeatable process, standardize it, document it, simplify it so that almost anyone could follow it, then license it. At first, no one cared. He pitched small operators. They said they could build their own systems. He approached local investors. They said it wasn't big enough. He shared the concept with friends. They said it sounded complicated. But he kept refining. He removed unnecessary steps, reduced friction, improved margins by small percentages that compounded over scale. He tested it quietly in 2 locations, then 3. The breakthrough wasn't dramatic, it was mathematical. When others used his system, he earned a percentage, small at first, almost insignificant. But unlike his old business, it didn't require his physical presence. Ownership had begun. The real shift happened when he realized something even more powerful. He didn't need to own the entire thing. He needed to own the structure. So he protected the process legally, built contracts carefully, structured revenue splits intelligently. He reinvested every dollar back into expanding the system rather than upgrading his lifestyle. Friends upgraded apartments, he upgraded leverage. Years passed before anyone called it success. From the outside, he still looked ordinary. No flashy car, no luxury signals, but behind the scenes, his network expanded. 10 operators became 20, 20 became 50, each one earning, each one sending him a small slice. Generational wealth rarely starts as a tidal wave. It starts as a trickle that no one respects. Then something unexpected happened. A larger company noticed the pattern. They weren't interested in his income. They were interested in his model. Because while others sold products, he had built infrastructure. And infrastructure scales differently. Negotiations began quietly. He didn't rush. He didn't overplay his hand. He understood that leverage increases when you're willing to walk away. The acquisition offer shocked him, not because it was enormous, but because it validated the idea. He declined, not out of arrogance, out of clarity. Selling would make him wealthy. Keeping it would make his children powerful. He restructured instead, brought in strategic capital without surrendering control, expanded into adjacent markets using the same core system, adjusted for regional differences, optimized logistics, strengthened branding. The idea evolved. It wasn't just about ownership anymore. It was about defensibility. He built barriers competitors couldn't easily cross. Long-term contracts, data advantages, supplier relationships, efficiency curves that improved with each additional partner. And then, quietly, the compounding began to show. Revenue multiplied not linearly, but exponentially. His percentage from each operator increased as the system improved. Margins expanded as scale reduced cost. What had once been dismissed as too small became unstoppable. Banks that once ignored him now offered credit. Investors who once doubted him now requested meetings. But he remembered the early years, the nights studying numbers alone, the rejections, the invisible grind, the decision not to chase income but to design ownership. The single idea had created something far larger than wealth. It had created durability. By the time the broader market shifted again, recession fears rising, volatility shaking fragile businesses, his structure held, because it wasn't built on hype, it was built on systems that produced value regardless of mood. Competitors collapsed. His network absorbed their market share. The idea that once seemed small now supported hundreds of families, including his own, across generations. Trust funds were structured carefully, education funded intentionally, assets diversified strategically, not to show wealth, to protect it. And when people asked him later how he did it, expecting a complex secret, he gave them the same answer every time. I stopped selling my time, I started owning the engine. It sounded simple, because it was. But simple ideas executed patiently reshaped bloodlines. And this was only the beginning.
Success did not make him comfortable. It made him visible, and visibility attracts resistance. At first, competitors dismissed him. They assumed his system was temporary, a trend, a lucky structure that would plateau once the market normalized. But when his network continued expanding, even during slow quarters, irritation turned into concern. They tried copying the model. On the surface, it looked easy. Standardize a process, license it, take a percentage. But they misunderstood something critical. The value wasn't in the checklist, it was in the refinement. For years, he had quietly improved tiny details no one noticed: vendor timing, payment cycles, incentive alignment, training psychology, conflict resolution structures. Small efficiencies layered on top of each other until the system operated smoother than intuition alone could replicate. Competitors copied the surface. They couldn't replicate the depth. Some lowered prices aggressively, hoping to squeeze his partners. He responded calmly. Instead of engaging in a race to the bottom, he increased support, added better reporting tools, improved supply chain discounts, strengthened the community between operators so leaving felt costly. He understood something fundamental: switching costs protect wealth. When the first recession threat arrived, the real test arrived. Demand slowed, consumer confidence dipped. Smaller independent operators panicked. Many feared they would collapse without deep financial reserves. But his model had been built precisely for this. Centralized purchasing lowered costs during volume decline. Shared marketing reduced individual exposure. Collective negotiation with suppliers secured flexibility. Most importantly, the operators weren't alone. Isolation destroys small businesses during downturns. Infrastructure protects them. While independent competitors struggled, his network stabilized. Some even grew as weaker players exited the market. The system absorbed market share not through aggression, but through durability. That was when generational wealth quietly crossed from possibility into inevitability. He began restructuring ownership strategically. Instead of holding everything directly, he created layered entities, holdings companies, asset protection vehicles, long-term trusts structured for tax efficiency. Not flashy moves, disciplined ones. Wealth that lasts generations isn't built only by earning, it's built by protecting. His children were still young, but he designed governance frameworks early. Clear rules, clear responsibilities, education requirements before access to capital. Wealth without discipline decays quickly. He had seen it happen too often. The second major crisis hit harder. Global instability, credit tightening, supply disruptions, entire industries stalled overnight. Even strong systems felt pressure. This time, fear was everywhere. But he wasn't reacting anymore. He was anticipating. Years earlier, he had diversified the revenue streams within his network. Some locations focused on premium services, others on recession-resistant essentials. Some leaned digital, others relied on local contracts insulated from global shocks. When disruption hit, not all segments suffered equally. Loss in one area was offset by resilience in another. Diversification wasn't random, it was engineered. Banks called to reassess risk exposure. Investors requested clarity. He provided numbers calmly. His debt ratios were conservative, cash reserves disciplined, expansion paced intelligently rather than emotionally. Competitors who had chased rapid growth through leverage began collapsing under interest pressure. He began acquiring selectively, not out of greed, but out of strategy. Distressed assets purchased cheaply, integrated into a system, optimized through existing infrastructure. What once cost competitors millions to build, he absorbed at fractions of value. The idea had evolved again. It wasn't just about licensing a system anymore. It was about controlling the ecosystem. Suppliers depended on his volume. Operators relied on his tools. Lenders respected his consistency. Competitors feared his patience. And still, from the outside, he remained understated. No loud interviews, no viral success speeches, no dramatic announcements. True generational wealth often grows quietly. By now, the numbers had reached levels that would have seemed impossible in his early years, but what mattered more was stability. His children's future education was guaranteed. Their children's security was mathematically protected. The trust structures were designed to distribute without destroying motivation. He had learned that money given without purpose dissolves. Money structured with intention multiplies. At a private meeting once, a young entrepreneur asked him what the breakthrough moment was. The young man expected a story about luck, or a big investor, or perfect timing. He shook his head. There was no breakthrough, he said. There was a decision. The decision to stop chasing income, the decision to design leverage, the decision to think in decades instead of quarters. The single idea had not just created wealth, it had changed his time horizon. While others measured progress yearly, he measured it generationally. Every contract was evaluated not just for profit, but for durability. Every partnership assessed not just for gain, but for alignment. By the time the broader economy stabilized again, his position was no longer vulnerable, it was foundational. His system supported livelihoods across regions. It created employment. It funded scholarships. It reinvested locally. Wealth, when structured correctly, compounds influence as well as money. And somewhere along the way, people stopped seeing him as the man who started with nothing. They saw him as inevitable. But inevitability is built from thousands of invisible adjustments. And he was still adjusting, because he understood even now, generational wealth is not protected by comfort, it is protected by continued evolution. And evolution was already demanding the next move. By the time his wealth became undeniable, a new problem emerged. It wasn't competition, it wasn't recession, it was succession. Money changes a family long before it changes a balance sheet.
His children had grown up differently than he had. They never saw eviction notices. They never calculated grocery totals in their heads. They never felt the humiliation of asking for extensions on bills. Their challenges were subtler: identity, expectation, pressure. He understood something that many wealthy founders ignore. The first generation builds. The second manages. The third risks losing everything. He refused to let that pattern repeat. So he began preparing long before anyone expected it. He didn't simply promise inheritance, he built qualification systems. Access to capital required education, apprenticeship, and demonstrated discipline. Family meetings weren't emotional gatherings, they were structured governance sessions. Financial literacy wasn't optional, it was mandatory. At first, there was resistance. His eldest son wanted rapid expansion into trend-based markets, high returns, high visibility. The numbers looked impressive on presentation slides, but he recognized the danger immediately: volatility disguised as opportunity. He didn't reject the idea outright. He asked questions. What happens in a downturn? What protects margins? What dependency does this create? What leverage risk are you introducing? The conversation wasn't about control, it was about durability. Slowly, the family began understanding the difference between wealth and momentum. Wealth is stable, momentum is temporary. Meanwhile, external pressure increased. Private equity firms approached aggressively. They saw his infrastructure as a scalable empire. Offers grew larger. Liquidity events dangled like trophies. Friends whispered that he was leaving billions on the table by not selling fully. But he measured differently. Selling would convert structure into cash. Structure compounds. Cash erodes. He negotiated partial liquidity instead, enough to diversify, not enough to surrender control. He reinvested into hard assets, land, logistics networks, technology backbones that strengthened the core model rather than distracting from it. Then came the internal fracture. One family member quietly resented the governance rules, felt constrained, believed the wealth should grant freedom without oversight. That tension threatened more than emotion, it threatened cohesion. Generational wealth collapses more often from internal division than external attack. He addressed it directly. Transparency replaced assumption. Financial statements were shared fully. Long-term projections explained in detail. Responsibilities clarified. Privileges balanced with accountability. He didn't lead with authority. He led with clarity. Over time, resentment softened into understanding. The wealth wasn't a reward, it was a responsibility. Meanwhile, outside the family, his influence expanded subtly. Educational institutions sought partnerships, local governments requested advisory input. Foundations emerged, funded not for publicity but for structural impact. Scholarships in logistics, entrepreneurship incubators tied to his network, mentorship programs rooted in ownership education. The idea had multiplied beyond money. It had created philosophy. Ownership over income, infrastructure over visibility, durability over speed. Competitors still existed, but few understood the deeper layer. They saw revenue, they didn't see architecture. They saw valuation, they didn't see governance. Years passed, markets cycled, technology evolved, consumer behavior shifted. Each time his structure adjusted without panic, because he had never optimized for a single era. He optimized for adaptability. One evening, during a private strategy retreat with his children, he asked them a simple question. If all of this disappeared tomorrow, what remains? Silence filled the room. Then his daughter answered, "The system." He nodded. Because the single idea had never been about money. It had been about designing something that could survive him. He began transitioning authority gradually, not abruptly, observing decision-making under pressure, allowing small mistakes in controlled environments, letting the next generation experience consequence without catastrophic risk. Leadership transferred like a relay, not a surrender. And then, one day, without announcement, without ceremony, he stepped back. Not fully, but enough. The company continued expanding. The trusts functioned as designed. Dividends flowed into structured channels. Reinvestment remained disciplined. Family governance meetings continued, now led by the next generation. He watched quietly. The boy who once delivered packages through neighborhoods he could never afford now oversaw assets that would shape neighborhoods for decades. The single idea had outlived its creator's daily involvement. That is when he knew it had worked. Generational wealth is not measured by net worth, it is measured by continuity. And continuity had been achieved. But history never stays still. A new technological wave was forming. Artificial systems replacing human decision-making, decentralized finance challenging traditional models, ownership itself evolving. The next evolution was coming, and this time he would not be the one adapting first. His children would.
The world shifted faster in the next decade than it had in the previous 50 years. Artificial intelligence began making investment decisions. Digital currencies challenged central banking systems. Entire industries moved from physical infrastructure to cloud-based ecosystems. Ownership itself became abstract. Tokens, shares, algorithms managing portfolios in milliseconds. The system he built was strong, but the environment was unrecognizable. This time, he did not lead the adaptation. His children did. They debated decentralization strategies. They evaluated blockchain-based logistics authentication. They explored automation layers that reduced human dependency but increased systemic precision. They didn't protect tradition for emotional reasons. They stress-tested it. And something remarkable happened. The original idea held, not because it resisted change, but because it was never tied to a specific technology. The single idea had always been this: own the foundation others depend on. When commerce digitized, they invested in data infrastructure. When finance decentralized, they invested in custodial security systems. When automation accelerated, they acquired intellectual property behind the automation tools rather than simply using them. They didn't chase innovation, they owned parts of innovation. Wealth multiplied quietly again. But now it wasn't just generational, it was institutional. Universities studied their governance model. Economists analyzed their trust structures. Business schools referenced their long-term strategy as a case study in durability. And yet, inside the family meetings, the rules never changed. No reckless leverage, no dependency on hype, no ego-based acquisitions. Reinvestment first, distribution second. One evening, long after he had stepped away from daily control, he walked through one of their earliest facilities, now fully automated, humming with precision. Robotic systems sorted, packed, dispatched. Data dashboards glowed across walls where clipboards once hung. He smiled, not at the scale, at the resilience. He remembered the first ledger he kept manually, the nights calculating margins under dim light. The fear of collapse that shaped every conservative decision. Fear had built discipline. Discipline had built structure. Structure had built wealth. And wealth, managed correctly, had built freedom. But freedom wasn't yachts or headlines. Freedom was optionality. His grandchildren would not be forced into survival decisions. They would choose their paths from stability, not desperation. That was the true dividend. History paid him everything, not because he chased history, but because he solved a permanent problem. Most people seek income, few seek ownership. Most people seek success, few seek continuity. Generational wealth isn't created by a lucky investment. It is engineered through philosophy, repeated consistently across time. Years later, during a quiet family gathering, one of his grandchildren, barely old enough to understand balance sheets, asked him, "Did you know this would happen?"
He paused. "No," he said honestly, "I only knew what I would never risk again." That answer carried more truth than any valuation ever could. He never aimed to become one of the wealthiest. He aimed to never be powerless again. The single idea wasn't flashy. It wasn't revolutionary on the surface. It didn't rely on invention or genius-level breakthroughs. It relied on discipline applied relentlessly. And that is why it survived technological revolutions, economic recessions, political shifts, and generational transitions. Because the core principle never expired: control assets that outlast trends. As the years passed, his public presence faded. No viral interviews, no aggressive branding campaigns. His name became quieter, but his structures became louder. Hospitals funded quietly, scholarships expanding annually, entrepreneurs mentored inside incubators built from dividend streams decades old. Impact without noise. That was the final evolution. He started with nothing. He built stability. He engineered continuity. And in doing so, he proved something history often forgets. Generational wealth is not about money lasting forever. It is about systems teaching responsibility forever. When he finally stepped entirely out of the picture, nothing collapsed. That was the ultimate victory. No chaos, no infighting, no asset liquidation, just continuity. The system kept moving, dividends reinvested, trusts distributed, businesses evolved, families governed. The idea no longer belonged to him, it belonged to time. And time kept paying. Because in the end, wealth that survives generations is not built on brilliance, it is built on restraint. Not on speed, but on structure. Not on luck, but on philosophy. And that is how a single idea, born from scarcity, shaped by fear, disciplined by patience, created generational wealth. Not overnight, not loudly, but permanently.